A modern coffee table with functional storage? All 10 of my haters said it couldn't be done, but I'm here to prove them wrong. We'll get to that in a second, but make sure and stay tuned to see all the unusual aspects of this build and an opportunity you might not want to pass up. When it comes to furniture design, I typically lean more towards the more modern pieces. So mid-century modern pieces or modern pieces, it's really the only kind of modern furniture that I can think of off the top of my head. But the point being is that I like modern furniture. Now, one big drawback that I seem to find in most modern furniture is that it's not the most practical. Now, that's not to say that modern furniture is not practical. It's just really to point out the fact that most modern furniture prioritizes the looks and the feel of the piece a little bit more than the function compared to some of the other styles. Feel free to let me know in the comments if you disagree with this statement, but that's what we're going with for now, unless somebody tells me otherwise. So, for this piece, I want to do something a little bit different and kind of challenge that status quo where modern can't be practical. What you've seen me doing so far in the video is milling up the lumber and getting it prepped and ready for our tabletop glue up. This coffee table is going to be having a jet black finish on it, so the color of the boards doesn't matter so much as the grain orientation. So my whole goal with laying these out was just to make sure that the grain complemented each other and kind of flowed across the piece nicely, because the grain is the only part that you're actually going to see at the end of the day. Most of my pieces are built to order, meaning that I already have a client lined up, they are able to input on the design, and then they purchase it off of me at the end of the build. But something that's different about this piece is that I had no client lined up whatsoever. Now, I enjoy doing fun projects like this from time to time because I have full control over the design process, and I can do fun things like throw out polls on my Instagram to see what my followers like versus dislike, and kind of go from there and take this piece in whatever direction I want to go. But with that comes a little bit of risk because I'm spending a lot of time, a lot of money and energy on this piece without any promise of a return. So it's an exciting process, but also a little bit risky. Now, to quote something that we've all heard, but nobody knows where it came from, with great risk comes great reward. And that reward today is actually your reward, because one of you will have the chance to actually purchase this piece if you go check out the link to my Instagram down in the description. Feel free to shoot me a DM there if you're interested in purchasing, and we can get something set up. That being said, I would definitely wait until the end of the video, or at least skip forward to the end so you can see what the final result looks like before offering to purchase it, because I don't want any disappointment here. I want whoever gets this to be very happy with the piece. Otherwise, it's just going to sit in my living room, and I guess I'll be happy with it. Tabletop glue-ups are kind of boring, so we've kind of been skimming through that process so far in the video. But a detail that I am adding to this tabletop that I think is honestly a little bit underutilized is these big radiuses on the corners. You'll be able to see how this ties into the rest of this piece a little bit later on in the video, but all you see me doing here is cutting out the excess with a jigsaw, then using a little template that I made in the shop to get those perfect edge radiuses. With those edge radiuses done, it was time to move on to fixing any of these little imperfections in the tabletop with this black CA glue. The black definitely sticks out like a sore thumb right now, but once we get this all finished, it'll blend in perfectly. The last step before moving on to the base of the coffee table is adding this little 1/8 inch roundover, and this is a detail that I add on most of my pieces. It just kind of helps tie in the piece together, leaves a nice clean professional look, and prevents the edges of the piece from getting damaged and nicked over time. I'm a bit of a novice when it comes to 3D modeling, but I did actually throw this into a model to get an idea for the overall dimensions and proportions of this piece. You might have noticed in that clip of the model, but the base for this coffee table is going to be pretty chunky, and it's going to mirror the overall shape of the tabletop. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted this piece to be both modern and functional. Now, because of this, I'm actually going to be building the base of this coffee table primarily out of plywood rather than the solid hardwood that I typically use. In order to get those consistent radiuses that are going to mirror the tabletop, I need to build a template in order to shape all my base pieces. What you'll see me doing here is taking one piece of plywood, taking it over to the bandsaw where I marked out the general radius of the shape that I want, and then I'm going to go ahead and sand it, which I did off camera, to get it dialed into a nice perfect shape. If you want to give off the illusion that you're much better at woodworking than you actually are, you should most definitely learn how to use templates and jigs, because templates like in this situation, one can help you create identical pieces, but they can also help with some complex joinery that you might have to do time and time again, and just leave the cleaner, more consistent results throughout the course of your work. So it's definitely a skill worth honing in a little bit and spending some time on. I showed you the clip of the 3D model just a minute ago, but I would definitely understand if you're a little bit confused as to how this is all going to come together. So don't worry if you're confused for now, it will all make sense here very shortly. But for now, we're actually going to be using that template to route out all of our pieces here. This flush template bit has a bearing that rides along the template and perfectly flushes up the new piece to the template itself so that we get perfectly identical pieces across the board. If you're interested in this template bit or really any of the other tools or products that I use in the course of this video, I'll definitely have some links to all those products down in the description so you can go check them out there and purchase them if you think it'd be helpful. Now at this point, all I've got is a bunch of pieces of plywood that do absolutely nothing for any of us until we get it assembled here. So that's exactly what we're gonna do. Now the reason that we're using plywood for the base of this table as the general skeleton of it, rather than like a solid hardwood that just looks good from the outside, is because we're actually gonna add a little surprise in this coffee table, and it's going to have a full operational cabinet storage area underneath the tabletop. Now the plywood skeleton for this coffee table base is not exactly friendly to the eyes, but don't worry, we're going to be covering this all up with either a hardwood veneered plywood or with actual hardwood itself. So don't panic, this is just the base, the structure that you'll actually never see. With the plywood skeleton just about wrapped up, you can kind of start to see the overall shape of this coffee table base and how it's going to actually mirror and complement the tabletop of this piece. As I pointed out there, I'm missing a section in the middle, and that's actually going to be where the door opens and shuts and where you can access that storage once this is all said and done. So all I'm doing is ripping down some white oak into some individual sheets because these will actually be finished, visible pieces. And I'm just going to tack them together with some pocket screws and glue to hold them together. I mentioned earlier that I didn't have a client for this piece, but ultimately the client was basically my Instagram followers because I put out so many polls asking what people liked and didn't like, and the resounding answer that I got is that yes, I should include storage. So even though this does add a ton of extra work to the build overall, I think it will be a good, useful addition and something that will add a lot of value to the piece overall. I guess all of you watching out there can be the ultimate judge of that, but I think it actually did end up being the best decision in the end. Now up until this point, we spent a lot of time building an ugly box, but at this point it's actually going to start to get kind of interesting, and we're going to be wrapping this whole base with a white oak veneered plywood. And by plywood, I actually meant MDF, but we're going to roll with it. Traditionally, MDF does not wrap around corners very easily, even these kind of gentle corners that we're going to have for our table base, but we're going to be utilizing these curve cuts in the back of the MDF to basically reduce the stress on that piece of wood so that it'll actually be able to wrap properly. These curve cuts took forever, but I actually kind of like how they looked on the outside, so I might try to incorporate something like that in one of my future builds. It's not every day that you get to break out the iron in the wood shop, but today was definitely that day because the heat that this was able to provide was actually crucial in getting these MDF panels to wrap around the edge of the plywood base. The curves on the backside of the panel are certainly helpful, but your biggest friend when it comes to bending wood is actually heat and moisture. So the iron paired with the spray bottle and the damp rag, I was able to actually bend these around the base of this coffee table pretty easily. This is my first go at any sort of bending wood, and it actually went pretty well. I did crack a couple panels in my practice runs, but I ended up getting this down pretty good, and 3 out of the 4 corners were actually perfect. This one corner that I'll show you here in just a second wasn't quite perfect, but I was able to kind of fix that later on, and nobody would ever be able to tell. I went ahead and did the actual glue up for this piece off camera because it was ultimately just a little too stressful to try to film and do the glue up properly all at once. But I was really pleased with how this was turning out, and we're kind of ready to start moving into the finishing stages of trimming out this coffee table base. I didn't want to leave any raw plywood exposed at the end of this build, so I went ahead and factored into my measurements when I was designing the piece so that I'd be able to add these hardwood edge bandings to this edge here and just kind of round that off and make it look clean. Taking the time to plan out small little details like this edge banding for example, might seem kind of like a waste of time, but I find that it's actually very crucial in delivering a high-end piece that doesn't run into surprises midway through the project and leave you wondering what you should do. With the base all trimmed out, it was time to add the decorative flutes that go along the entire outside of our coffee table base. Now I had to be really careful when placing these because I wanted it to line up perfectly so that they actually helped conceal the eventual door in the coffee table base so that it was almost invisible when it's closed. So to make these flutes, I ended up actually just using a handheld router and then ripping it down on my table saw. And this would probably have been a little bit easier on something like a router table, but I didn't have access to that at the time, so this is the method that I used, and ultimately it worked out pretty well in order to get these all cut down to size. At this point in the build, I was actually a little bit hesitant to be adding these flutes because I was actually really liking the clean look of the wrapped plywood base. But as I mentioned earlier, this piece is actually going to be finished black, And one of the biggest elements when you're designing a piece that's going to be a very dark color like this is to make sure that you have some intriguing visual elements so it doesn't just become a dark blob in the center of your room, because if you just do too many clean, solid surfaces, it tends to just kind of all disappear. So these flutes are actually going to really help in adding some dimension to the piece overall, and I think will add some visual intrigue. Most of the time at this point in the build, you're pretty much reaching the finish line and you're almost ready to slap on some finish and call it a day. But after we get the inside of this box trimmed out, we'll actually be entering some of what I think is the most interesting parts of this build. And we get to fully say goodbye to all those ugly plywood pieces, which I am very thankful for. Something that I wanted to maintain throughout this build is to make sure that the cabinet door entry to the storage underneath this coffee table is completely hidden. In order to do that, we're going to use some concealed hardware and also this recessed finger pull that we're going to use to actually open up the cabinet door. This is a huge router bit, so I definitely should have done this in more than one pass, but you know, gotta get that content, baby, so one pass it is, and it went okay. Adding the flutes to the outside of the door was the same process, and pretty much just continued on that same pattern that we did on the rest of the coffee table base. Now, this wouldn't be a woodworking YouTube video without me adding my maker's mark. And on top of that, I'm a little bit cheap and those branding irons are expensive, and I'm also a bit of a contrarian because I just hate doing what everybody else is doing. So with probably way more detail than you would have wanted, this is my solution to that problem. And I basically just punch in the letters of my business name, and it provides a nice, clean, yet very subtle maker's mark to this piece. I made this last piece of the coffee table base off camera, but I'm actually very excited to share this little detail, and I think this is a design element that adds so much to the piece overall. Initially, I was wanting to do a full brass base for this, but I looked into the pricing on that and it would have been outlandish. So this was my solution to wanting some sort of metallic element to kind of lighten up the feel of the piece. And this is a process called gilding. This is more of an arts and crafts type thing. I got all these supplies at Hobby Lobby, but with a little bit of care, this actually applies super easily and gives that same overall feel that I was going for. We're going to do a different top coat finish for the rest of the piece, but on this gold gilling part, I went ahead and just did a spray lacquer to help protect it over time. The way that we're going to get a jet black finish on this piece is using India ink. So this is actually used primarily for calligraphy, but it works really well for dyeing wood, just a deep, dark, rich black. I actually use this same finish for my personal coffee table in my own home, and I really love how it turned out and really just the overall ease of application. One thing that's nice is that it's water-based and it's non-toxic, so all it does is make your shop smell like a newspaper, which isn't the worst thing in the world, to be honest. I'm not a big calligraphy guy, so using India ink to finish a wood project is kind of new to me, but this might be old news to you, so let me know in the comments if this is something that you've seen before, or if it's something that is new to you as well. After getting that base piece installed, I was really loving the contrast between the black and the gold, and really looking forward to how this finished piece is going to look after we get our top coat on. Now the top coat that I'm choosing to use for this is actually called Rubio Monocoat, something that's pretty popular these days, but it's popular for good reason. It's super easy to apply and offers a great level of protection to the piece. My one complaint when it comes to Rubio Monocoat is the fact that it doesn't have very much flexibility in regards to sheen, so it definitely leaves a pretty matte finish, but one way that you can kind of alleviate that after you get the first coat applied is to actually add a second coat. So I'll show you here in a second what I mean, but it looks pretty good after this first coat, but we want to enhance that sheen just a little bit more. So I go ahead and take a light abrasive pad and run that over the length of the piece before going to add my second coat. The application of the second coat is pretty much the exact same as the first. The only difference is that I usually dry buff it after wiping off all the excess in order to just get that little extra bump in sheen. I had to work on some other projects and switch shops in the meantime, but a couple months later, I was actually able to get to the final finishing stages of this piece where I added all the hardware. What you see here is a magnetic push opener that basically prevents me from needing any sort of exposed hardware on the outside of the cabinet door. I was really happy with the function of this piece of hardware, and to pair with that, I went ahead and added the soft close hinges to the door itself. This is something that I pretty much add on all my pieces just because I think the soft close makes it feel so much better when you're using the piece. We haven't even gotten to our beauty shots yet, but this door is almost completely disappearing once it's actually closed. The last step in the build is to attach the tabletop to the base, and all I'm doing for that is using these simple figure-8 fasteners that allow for seasonal wood movement. Thank you so much for watching this video. It really does mean the world that you take the time out of your day to watch my content, so I very much appreciate that. And if you found value in this video or enjoyed it, make sure and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of my future content that will be coming out in the near future. And again, if you'd like to purchase this piece, go ahead and reach out to me on Instagram where I have free shipping for it, so we'll get something worked out. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.